couple of minutes just to chat to you about sponges, menstrual sponges. As Luca introduced, this was on the my choice for the poster, because it's something that I'm quite passionate about, but so many people don't seem to know about. If you are someone who menstruates and you're a sex worker, many of us cannot afford to take a week off work, every time that we get our period, and so a menstrual sponge is something that you can use that's safe, and that will mean that you can easily work on your period. And unfortunately, it's just not really well known about. And so, because these things don't tend to be provided with outreach supplies, for example, people are giving, condoms and lube, more condoms that you can shake a stick at, but menstrual sponges just don't tend to be included. And so people are really often resorting to using things that are not ideal, Myself, I definitely, at one point, a kitchen sponge was an emergency situation that I had to use. But people are, there's certainly worse. I'm not going to give you all the gory details. And so just if you are a healthcare provider, a service provider, if you're ever doing outreach, if you can include menstrual sponges as part of your toolkit, that would be awesome. People who menstruate will thank you very much. Okay, with that said, so this panel is Unpacking Stigma and Discrimination Faced by Sex Workers. We have, I believe, 4 different presentations. And we're going to start with, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, but the title is, I've Just Schooled You, So You Can't Shame Me. Stigma, Discrimination and Healthcare Access Among Sex Workers in Scotland, the Republic of Ireland, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank God Finn told me how to say it last time, so that I didn't just... But yeah, Jordan and Becky, do you want to come up?
Oh, no applause.
Just, sorry, go.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, so, where's our slides? That was a really good start, lads. So I should start by saying I'm a little bit tired. I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to get here from Scotland. Becky's also quite tired, I think, coming all the way from Ireland. And she is Irish and I'm Scottish, so the accents, good luck. That's all I'm going to say. You're welcome. Anyway, okay, there we go. Thank you so much. So yes, my name is Jordan. I am a third-year PhD researcher from the University of Stirling in Scotland. I'm also a staff member for National Ugly Mugs and a sex worker. Woo! I know, right? I know, so novel in this crowd. But it's really fun that you can come to these things and say, I'm a sex worker, and it's not weird. Because, kind of sucks at some conferences when they're like, oh, they let you in, I see. Do you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Becky, and I'm a sex worker and activist from Ireland. And I was one of the community researchers, our peer researchers on this project as well.
Thank you. And our non-presenting author, Lindsay Armstrong, is a fantastic academic from New Zealand. And she's not here because New Zealand is quite far away. She works at the University of Wellington, and this project was funded by the Marsden Fund. And yeah, we're just here to chat about what basically some of the preliminary findings were. This is a really big fucking project, so we're only really... Oh, is this record? Sorry, can you swear? Oh, okay. And press record now. So yeah, huge project. This is only really a snapshot of what we did. This is not really that comprehensive, and we were really only looking at 1 or 2 themes, but yeah. So yeah, let's go. Oh, back one slide. No. Ignore this.
Gone through the whole thing now, you'll have to figure this out.
Oh, yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Nailed it. Okay, so the overall objective was to really just to explore perceptions and experiences and how these sex workers navigate these experiences of stigma and discrimination within 3 specific legal environments, and that is Scotland, Ireland, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. This is the research team here across all 3 nations, and the methods that we used, it was really just kind of semi-structured, but pretty in-depth interviews with 70 sex workers and 14 key informants. The key informants we're not talking about today because we thought it'd be cool to focus on sex workers, because we love that. So just briefly, the social legal frameworks for anyone who's not familiar. Scotland, we have partial crim, boo, bad. So selling sex indoor is legal, but pretty much everything else is illegal. So that sucks, we don't like that. So you can't sell sex outdoors, you can't work together, because that's called brothel keeping. There's also been a recent push for Nordic model. Bad.
And Ireland, we have the Swedish model, even worse. And I'm sure most of you know, so selling sex is legal if you're outdoors or indoors, but on your own. But paying for sex isn't, and working with others is also illegal.
Cool, and obviously I assume most people know New Zealand has decrim. Yay, we love that. So selling sex and the purchase of sex is completely permitted, but it only applies to New Zealand nationals. So migrants cannot sell sex, but they're working on this. All right. So just a brief overview. So generally what we found, how cool is this, by the way? I made that. That's cool. I thought it was cool. So in the pink is New Zealand, and basically they basically found healthcare to be pretty accessible and generally reported lower levels of stigma and discrimination within these settings compared to sex workers from Scotland and Ireland. So yes, Scotland is actually, let me just show you where Scotland is. Scotland is here. And it's nice. It's a nice place. So sex workers in Scotland reported pretty mixed responses, to be honest. There were significantly fewer sex workers in Scotland who would actually disclose sex work to a GP or any kind of other healthcare provider, which is a bit unfortunate. Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, Ireland was kind of the same, that there was a lot of secrecy, non-disclosure, and then feelings of being stigmatised within healthcare settings. So yeah.
And now we're going to read these walls of text at you. Sorry. We just have to. So Blue from Scotland, so this first one was about general accessibility of healthcare. So Blue from Scotland said, getting monthly checkups was impossible unless I said to them, look, I'm a sex worker, I'm high risk, I need to get sexual health checkup. And that was almost my exact line. And I still sometimes have to argue a little bit with them whenever I call up and have to be like, no, I can get an appointment. Trust me, please go talk to. I have to do the, can I talk to the manager? But sometimes you need to. And Madeline, also from Scotland, said, I would love services which are, they don't have to be delivered by sex workers, but they just need to be non-judgmental. And I don't know, what's the third sector speak? Person-centred. All my experience with the services in Scotland is they do not listen to you. You turn up there and you're like, ask me what services I need. And they are like, no, we don't want your opinion. You don't know what you need. I don't care if they are sex workers. They just need to respect you as a human being. If you want to provide services, the absolute least you can do is not alienate people from your services.
And so we've quotes from the sex workers in Ireland as well. Poppy went to a doctor, a GP, and when she disclosed that she was a sex worker, she was asked immediately if she was trafficked. That made her feel quite vulnerable, being put on the spot like that. But then further to that, she was checked for lesions by the doctor. And, that was quite a shaming experience for her. But she had the confidence to say this to the GP, that it was inappropriate to ask the questions like that, and especially having already spoken to the nurse beforehand. And the GP's response was, well, oh, people don't often know themselves, and after a few sessions, things often reveal themselves, and also my nurse isn't qualified to ask these questions. And Poppy said, well, she's qualified to treat me as a person. And then Ronan, who's been to several different healthcare services, has said that his experiences have been mixed, but that overall he finds the male doctors to be a little less judgmental. The woman GP, again, jumped straight to asking, are you trafficked? To which he replied, like, bitch, how is that even the first question you're gonna ask me? Obviously fucking not. But, you know, if I was a trafficking victim, I wouldn't have came in here and told you straight out what I'm doing. But again, he felt that his current GP, every time that he goes to her, she looks disgusted to touch me. So again, we're seeing the stigma.
And some quotes from New Zealand. So this worker was talking about an experience they had with the person doing their sexual health screening. And they said she wouldn't do a throat swab, and I was telling her, do the throat swab. And we had this whole thing about it, and it turned out she didn't even know how to do the throat swab, and I had to show her how to do that. So I was like, look, this is what I do, and this is why I'm so stringent, and also, why do I have to beg for this? You're the medical professional. But she was all right, and she basically said to her, oh, that makes a lot of sense. No wonder you've got so much knowledge. And she said, basically because she was in the position of educating the healthcare professional, she basically couldn't shame her. She said, I've just schooled you, so you can't shame me. And then Jane, also from New Zealand, said, it's always the first thing I bring up. I say, I'm a sex worker. I'm definitely straight up. It's an important thing for me. It's an important thing for the doctors to know as well. I was in hospital recently. I had a virus and was talking about when can I work again? And that's stuff that I'm not always going to know. I'm not a doctor. So I've got to be straight up, and I've got to say, yes, I sometimes share bodily fluids because I kiss people. And so how long do I have to wait before I can go back to work? Oh, yeah. And then this is the Scotland quotes. So Jake from Scotland said, yeah, so I always tell these people because I think it's important to do. Sometimes there's like, oh, I feel so sorry for you. But most of the time it's quite good, especially in terms of sexual health. Carl said he was talking to a nurse, and basically he was saying he was really happy that she was young and kind of like with it. And that kind of really influenced the experience he had. Basically saying that sometimes younger healthcare professionals kind of understand stuff a bit more in relation to sex work. So he said, and it was so great to have this nurse. She was just like, she knew about all of it, you know, and she was informed, and she told me there was a box you tick, so you get some prioritizing and stuff. So I would say it was about the individual you have. I could have had a very different nurse and a very different experience, or they could just not have known enough about it. And Elle from Scotland said they've never really had a bad experience, never been lectured. Sometimes they just do their job and get on with it, and you can tell they're not really comfortable or happy with what you do. And you mention it, and they just kind of go, and do you use condoms? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, you should, you know. And I'm like, I just said yes. I love a dramatic reading.
And then in New Zealand, when it comes to disclosing to GPs, Bella said that the first GP that I told was just indifferent about it, and the second and third one, and the one that I told, they were great. I've not had a problem. Michelle adds, my personal GP knows about it, and she went, oh, good on you. And she always sort of laughs because I tell her work stories and stuff, so we have a great laugh. Natasha, do you want to read that? Yeah.
So Natasha said, one time I went to hospital specifically with this horrible stomach ache, and I had fevers, and it turned out to be a pelvic infection. And I told them straight away I was working as an escort, and I think they were able to kind of get the diagnosis a lot quicker because of that. I remember speaking to one of the nurses, actually, and then because I was planning to have my mum come in, and she said, oh, it says you're working in the sex industry. dot, dot, dot. You know, I'll make sure to not to tell your parents. And I was like, thank you, thank you. Great experience.
And then in Ireland, we have Mandy, who said, I remember actually saying in a counselling session in a treatment centre about doing this, and I remember having my head on the ground and being full of anxiety and shaking and saying that I was on the game, these horrible ways of putting it, like as bad as a murderer. And Baya said that she told the doctor that she disclosed to, she told me I should change my life, that I should have a normal job. Sarah doesn't disclose because she's afraid of getting these sort of responses. So she said, I never did. I didn't really believe or trust that I would ever be treated in the same way as like a regular civilian person. So no, I never brought it up with doctors. And then Caroline said, so I tell my GP, like she knows, but that's because I have a very good GP who also works in safety net clinics with people in addiction and homelessness. And that was one thing that came out quite strongly in the Irish interviews. I think we did have quite a few participants that were street workers and that were homeless. They found that the healthcare workers in the kind of social inclusion services for addiction and homeless people were a bit more open and understanding, and because they dealt with it more regularly, they were more comfortable disclosing to those GPs, nurses and the likes.
Sweet. So yeah, just to kind of wrap up what we've said, how are we doing for time? Right on time? We're gonna... We've been speaking for 45 minutes. Well, this is us wrapping up, so it's fine. So yeah, in conclusion, sex workers based in New Zealand just kind of had more latitude in terms of disclosing sex working to healthcare professionals, GPs, people who did their sexual health screening, stuff like that, and generally reported greater levels of just general accessibility. And responses from Scotland indicated very inconsistent levels of accessibility, and they were pretty cagey about actually disclosing whether they did sex work or not, and that kind of goes across the board for all healthcare professionals. And the Irish-based sex workers conveyed pretty high levels of dissatisfaction with their healthcare providers, as you can see from the quotes we read. And many sex workers left these experiences feeling pretty stigmatized or discriminated against for disclosing their working lives. So more positive experiences were described by those accessing specialist services for marginalized communities, like Becky just said. So yes, that's us. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to check. Yeah, we're basically on time, so I've got it now. Okay. All right. Now, I am especially afraid that I might pronounce your names wrong, so I am going to let you introduce yourselves just to avoid making this faux pas. But the next presentation is titled, How Do Different Types of Stigma Affect Occupational Risks in Sex Work?
Thank you. How do I put my presentation on? So I can already start. Hello, everybody. I'm Iztok. My surname is Šori. I come from the Peace Institute in Ljubljana, Slovenia. I work as a researcher and director there. What does peace has to do with sex work? We are broadly working on human rights and anti-discrimination issues, which we think are, of course, prerequisitions for peace. I will present today part of our research project, which is titled Occupational Risks in Sex Work at the Intersections of Policy Framework and Social Stigma. And I'm, of course, very pleased to be here with you today. The main purpose of my presentation is to show that stigma is a complex phenomena and that we must distinguish between different types of stigma when considering how to improve the occupational health and safety of sex workers. What do I mean? Oops. I will specifically talk about 6 types of stigma, about anticipated, experienced, internalized, layered, perceived, and secondary stigmas, and how they affect 5 domains of occupational risks. That is access to services, private lives, health, safety, and career advancement. By the latter, I mean risks such as discrimination on the labor market. I will also address the question how stigmas affect occupational risks in different legal models regulating sex work. And in conclusion, I defend the thesis that different forms of stigma work as a web, intersect, and complement each other. The starting point of our research was the finding that empirical studies often fail to adequately consider the complexity of stigma in its operationalization. Notably, there is a lack of distinction between different types of stigma in many of these studies. This can, however, be important. Let me demonstrate shortly what I mean on the question how stigma affects mental health of sex workers. Poorer mental health can be a result of several types of stigma. First, of discrimination by close persons or in health institutions due to sex worker status, which we would then call experienced stigma. Then we have avoidance of medical help due to expected poor and prejudiced treatment, which would be anticipated stigma. Then there could be internalized beliefs of sex workers about the immorality of their work, which would then be internalized stigma, and so on. Similarly, it is interesting to consider the impact of different types of stigma on other occupational risks. To at least partly close this research gap I mentioned and to better understand how various types of stigma operate, we conducted a systematic literature review which included 90 qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method studies published globally between 2010 and 2020. All studies included sex workers in their samples, altogether more than 8,300 participants. We reviewed, coded, and analyzed all these studies according to the PRISMA guidelines and came to the following results. First, I will address the question, what are the associations between different types of stigma and specific occupational risks based on the results of previous studies. In this respect, we examined 6 types of stigma and we explored how they affect 5 domains of occupational risks, which I mentioned in the introduction. Most evidence in analyzed studies points to the negative impact of experienced, anticipated, and internalized stigmas. And occupational risk domains most affected are access to services and private lives. We found numerous evidences also for other types of stigma and occupational domains. Let's look into the definitions and effects of individual types of stigma now. First, if I start with the experienced stigma, this is manifested in the form of prejudiced, biased, discriminatory, and violent treatment of sex workers in different work and life situations, from when accessing services to private lives. Evidence show that experiences of stigmatization have negative impact on mental health, encourage risky behavior, hinder the development of close relationships, and may lead to social isolation, ultimately increasing sex workers' vulnerability. Moreover, experienced stigma frequently results in the anticipation of further stigmatization. So we are now at the anticipated stigma, which is displayed as the fear of or expectation of negative reactions or discrimination, which influences sex workers' decision to hide their stigmatizing attribute, that is their work, and consequently lead a double life. As a result, seeking support from close individuals and institutions becomes difficult. Anticipated stigma imposes a significant psychological burden and may lead to loss of self-confidence, burnout, social distancing, isolation, and anxiety. That's what previous studies show. Then I will move to internalized stigma, which manifests itself as a feelings of guilt, particularly in relation to close persons, and also as normalization or self-blame for experienced discrimination and violence. These internalized stigmatizing beliefs create barriers to seeking and utilizing necessary support and services. Additionally, research shows associations between internalized stigma and substance use, risky behaviors, poorer mental health, and lower self-esteem. I will move now to perceived stigma, which is displayed as beliefs and attitudes that sex workers hold about how society perceives and judges them. This perception of stigma can have a profound impact on sex workers' inclusion in decision-making processes, self-esteem, and willingness to seek help and support. I will move to layered stigma now. This affects individuals who possess multiple stigmatized identities, such as those who have HIV infections or drug users. Last but not least, secondary stigma affects individuals close to sex workers, particularly children and partners, who may experience avoidance by acquaintances, harassment, or mistreatment within institutions. I will now move to the second research question, namely, are there any differences how different types of stigma affect occupational risks within different legal frameworks regulating sex work? What we could see from our analysis is quite a dispersed picture. It seems that various types of stigma operate in all legislative models and affect all occupational risks. Nonetheless, studies included in the review and others indicate that decriminalization can mitigate certain occupational risks, including vulnerability to stigma. And based on our results, we can assert that most evident distinctions among legislative models lie in the realm of police handling, while adverse, inappropriate treatment by police is reported in all legislative models. Evidence of targeted raids, extortion, and physical and sexual violence is more likely to appear in full criminalization and other repressive models. And to move now to my third issue here, at the same time, the results which I presented indicate that the dispersed picture of stigma-associated risks across legal models can be attributed to inherent nature of stigma. I will demonstrate this with the following table. With our analysis, we have identified 5 domains of stigma-associated occupational risks. You can find these domains on the left. And in the top row, you can find different types of stigmas, and then you can see how these intersect. The table, as I said, shows how various types of stigma affect various occupational risks. Where there is an intersection, there is this cross. As we can see, most of the domains are affected by various types of stigma simultaneously. This indicates that stigmas do not operate in isolation, but rather interact and intersect with one another. Three overreaching domains exhibited in particularly extensive cross-sectional character as they appeared at the intersection with numerous types of stigma. These include the vulnerability for STIs, which was found to be linked with all types of stigma except of secondary stigma, while mental distress and barriers to utilization of services were found to be strongly associated with the anticipated, experienced, internalized, and perceived stigmas at the same time. As we see, several other domains also encompass various types of stigma. These are, for example, negative impact of work on the relationships, exposure to violence and harassment, role conflict, discrimination, prejudicial or inappropriate treatment, normalization of discrimination and violence, and negative impact on self-esteem. Although some of the domains shown here occur in the intersection with one type of stigma, we anticipated that further research may reveal associations with other types as well. So in all situations and all legal models, the effect of stigma must be observed as a, let's say, complex web in which different types of stigma operate simultaneously. And to come to the conclusion, while the body of evidence on the negative impact of stigmas is extensive, therefore perhaps also daunting, stigma not only creates conditions for marginalizations, but also opportunities for empowerment at the macro level, by which I mean advocacy, at the meso level, by which I mean social support and solidarity, and micro level, by which I mean resilience. So what do these findings from our research tell us? What can we learn from this? What policy actions are needed? First, since access to services is one of the most problematic areas, across countries employing various legislative models governing sex work, there is a need for comprehensive training programs to educate police, health workers, and other officials about the importance of providing non-stigmatizing treatment to sex workers. Second, various publics, including clients, should be informed and sensitized about sex workers' rights. Third, any policy intervention, any support program, any change in legislation must recognize and acknowledge the diverse types of stigma that influence occupational risks within the realm of sex work and that these intersect. If we want to tackle stigma, it makes a difference if we talk about, for example, experienced, anticipated, or any other types of stigma. And finally, stigma is, of course, a question of power and oppressive social norms with respect to gender, to sexual orientation, monogamy, and sexuality. So consequently, it is imperative to actively challenge and dismantle these norms, what sex workers actually already do in their daily lives. Now it's the turn on policymakers, researchers, institutions, and others to tackle the issue. Thank you.
Thank thank you so much. I forgot to say earlier, but there will be time for questions. We'll have everyone together at the end. Okay, now we have Ruby. The presentation is called Intersectional Analysis on Sex Work Phobia in Western Europe. Thank you so much.
You mean?
No, the plus. No, the comment. We can just.
Yeah, can you
like
like
this.
this? Yeah, I think that's the best.
So. Hello. I am a little nervous because of my English. It's not so well in use, and so I hope you can understand me. Well, you know, we had such a high academic level, and now, well, okay, my perspective is as a peer researcher, as a sex worker, and what I try to do is to contextualize with the political situations we are currently in Western Europe. I work as a anti-discrimination trainer in Germany, and so my basic focus is to provide connectivity with other discriminations, and in order to do that, I'm trying to provide a structural, systemic definition. So I basically do research on the far right and on the Christian right, and well, of course, to counteract them in their wrongdoing against sex workers. So you already have seen that something isn't working as I wanted it to work, so we do the ups and downs. So first, what we are going to do is take a look at the term I'm using, which is sex work phobia. Well, all these terms, they have their upsides and downsides. I decided for this one for a specific reason, but there might be other good reasons to use whorephobia or sex work discrimination, so, you know. And we are looking on the term of sex work phobia from an institutional point of view, from an economical point of view, and from a cultural point of view, and also from an individual point of view. And then we regard it as a discrimination which is intersecting with different other discriminations, and well, then we will see how this means structural violence against sex workers. And in the second part, we take a look at the different discrimination categories which interfere with sex work phobia, and we take a very brief, a very short glance at the broad historical context. And last but not least, we take a look again on the anti-sex work alliances and their strategies. So I brought with me a definition, and I would say sex work phobia is the structural and systemical entanglement of institutional, economical, cultural, and individual discrimination sex workers are subjected to. Sex work phobia has its own historical predispositions, which reflect in current political, cultural, and social phenomena like othering or exclusion. This is very academic, and so let's take a look what that means. Institutional or institutionalized sex work phobia reflects in laws, criminalization, political othering, defamation of sex workers, and many other institutional phenomena. The economical sex work phobia can show as deplatforming from social media or from platforms to earn money. It can show as exclusion from economical participation, such as bank accounts, loans, insurances, and many, many more. Cultural sex work phobia shows in slurs, and these slurs are often decoupled from sex workers and transferred to non-sex workers. And in a flawed, stereotypical, or insufficient media coverage and representation. So we see a lot of bias, othering, and context-free journalism. Context-free means a sex worker which is shown in the standard media representation often doesn't have a history, a biography, or anything which individualizes the sex worker. And last but not least, the individual sex work phobia that reflects in barriers or exclusion from familial, romantic, friendly relationships, but also in victim blaming. So let's put it like that. The sex worker is the reason for the discrimination, not the discrimination or the political circumstances the sex worker finds itself in. So I just want to ask, is that representation? And intersecting discriminations, like we just heard about, means always structural violence against sex workers. So we find again the different circles, like individual sex work phobia, economical, institutional, and cultural sex work phobia, and where they intersect with each other, we find ourselves in a structural violence. So now, if we take a look at the intersections of discrimination with sex work phobia, and I have mentioned the ideologies of inequality, because this is very important to keep in mind. The sex worker is regarded unequal. The work of a sex worker is not valued as work, and all these inequalities, they end up in narratives and in storytelling about sex workers, which are inherently harmful to sex workers. So this is not a complete intersectional review of sex work phobia. So this is why there are some pluses, and you are free to add more pluses. I'm open for your remarks. But in the Western European context, we do have the LGBTQIA phobia. We have the historical context of anti-Semitism and structural anti-Semitism. We have the context of lookism, so all this which is regarded as slut-shaming because of a certain look a person has. We have the racism or migration biography. We have ableism, misogyny, trans misogyny, sexism, classism, adultism, ageism, and its intersections with sex work phobia. So just a short glance to the broad historical context. The privilege of Christianity is always operating with a narrative of the necessary evil. Yeah, it's like within the theologists or the Christian, like persons like Augustinus or Luther, yeah, they will always talk about prostitution or sex work as something which is evil, but it's necessary within society as a projection, yeah, for, I don't know the English word, where you are like blaming sexuality, promiscuity, and all which is intersecting with promiscuity. Then we have the historic circumstances of the witch hunts, which come together with depreciation and exclusion. Just as a reminder, sex workers were asked, or not only asked, but forced to wear specific colors in the medieval ages. And so this all ends up also in exclusion. Then we have the association with disease and STI, which is also already in the necessary evil included, but gets refined and reactivated, like in the so-called HIV crisis, but also in COVID in 2020. Then we have later the concentration and the policing in so-called red light districts. And we have in Germany, but in many other European countries, the context of fascism and the ideology of inequalities. So, and this all leads to this horrible anti-sex work alliances, which operate with different subjects and topics, like anti-gender. In Germany, we name it anti-feminism, and far-right narratives and storytelling. And all these movements, they can agree on the term of a world without prostitution. And they can integrate very different movements, like the Christian right, with evangelical or fundamental churches. We have the extreme right or the far right movement. We have a neoconservatism, which is operating familistic scenarios, like we have to protect the children and the women. Then we have radical feminism and its alliances into left-wing swerfism. We have the incel movement with the masculinism, which ended up in Atlanta 2021. And we have the second movement, or the second wave of feminism, the so-called white feminism. And they are very different in their approach, but they can agree on the term of a world without institution, and they will ally up against sex workers. And how do they do that? They operate 3 strategies amongst many, many others, but one is lawfare, and I think we are all together on lawfare here because we are looking forward to find a more anti-discriminatory law for sex workers in Europe, but they come with all these, what we have seen in the first lecture. I've forgotten the titles of the European Parliament. So this is lawfare, and this is very similar to the anti-reproductive rights movement in the US. And what they do is they want to influence the laws. And everything they do is to provide influential campaigns to change the law within the specific countries. And in Germany, we are experiencing this in a very, very violent way since the last 6 months, and really walking straight towards Nordic model in Germany. And the next step, what they do is they take spaces. So they will infiltrate academia, they will infiltrate counseling centers, they will ally up with voluntary movements on the streets, and this is how they create an atmosphere where in Germany you cannot say sex work anymore unless you are identifying for a specific political idea and an sex work friendly approach towards politics. And the next and the last step is control the narrative and to control the storytelling, which ends up in all these reproductions of stigma we have listened to in the quotes, in the other presentations, which we were talking about in the morning already. And all of this is storytelling and political storytelling in order to engage with the civil society. And then all this is not only a process, it's a combined action. So where do we are at the moment? I think in a moment where appeasement is not a strategy, because they will never stop. They, like in the USA, they change the reproductive rights, the sexual rights, and then the next step they do is, they work it up. And we will end in a very, very hostile environment if we still appease them any longer. So, and last but not least, I'll show you, you're not supposed to be able to read anything from this, but this is what I do behind the scenes. I'm looking to all these personalities, to all these political parties, and I'm like observing the far right and their relationships with the Christian right, and then we'll see like a full picture. And I think it is very important to analyze all these different political alliances and NGOs in order to find a strategy, a political strategy against client criminalization and for the end of sexworkphobia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And your English was flawless, by the way. Okay, now we come to our final speaker, who coincidentally has the same name as someone I went to school with. So I had a brief panic, thinking that I was about to be outed to the whole class of 08, and they were going to be like, "Oh, that's why Maren wasn't at the 10-year reunion." But no, it's you're someone else. The presentation is impact of stigma and legal frameworks on the health and safety of online adult content creators in the UK. Rebecca.
Doesn't have my same surname.
Not the middle name, but the surname, yes.
The surname?
Yes.
No way.
Not the middle name, though.
The surname? I thought I was the only one in the world.
Sorry.
Wow, okay. This one here.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
This one, right?
Yes. Okay, so if I do yes. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our panel today. My name is Rebecca, and I am a lecturer in the School of Law at Oxford Brookes University. And today I'm going to be talking about the stigma around porn work and how this inhibits the enforcement of health and safety regulations in the UK context. So I'm going to try and make it less boring and with less legal information. But what I'm going to be covering is what is the stigma in the porn industry and what I mean by this. I will look at porn content creators' employment status under UK law and how I argue that porn platforms should be under the duties to protect the health and safety of porn content creators because of their need of adequate training and because we need to protect them from being infected by sexually transmitted diseases and infections. But however, the stigma around porn work is really impacting the enforcement of existing legal rights in the porn industry. Before I start, I would like to say that I like using the expression porn content creators rather than adult content creators, and I hope I'm not offending any individual working in the porn industry, but it's because when I use the term adult, I feel I'm kind of glossing over or watering down the fact that I'm looking at sex work, so I don't want to give up the terminology of porn because I don't want to hide the fact that I'm looking at sex work, which is something that it's important to do in academia because sex work is really stigmatized. So when I refer to the stigma of sex work, I rely on the work of Goffman, who's a sociologist, and it might seem a little bit outdated, his work, but actually it's important to see how stigma is really powerful. Goffman differentiates within society those who are normal individuals and those who are stigmatized because of discrediting attributes. And he argues that stigma is not something that exists in and on itself in society, but it is something that is triggered by social interaction. When the normals interact with those who are perceived to be having these discrediting attributes, that's when stigma starts. And those who are seen as having these discrediting attributes are seen as are perceived as immoral and are actually treated not in a human manner. And it's interesting that in his work, Goffman refers to sex workers as a good example of individuals who have stigma. He defines them as the core of social deviance because they engage in some kind of collective denial of the social order. And I think that this is still the case today because the way sex work is perceived, both in the common imaginary, but especially in the legal sphere, is still due to stigma. Stigma is really powerful and is attaching these sticky emotions such as disgust to sex work, to the point that very often sex work is labeled as dirty work. And this is very clear in the case of porn, because the porn industry is a clear example of a legal branch of the sex industry. But yet, there is very little acknowledgement of the porn industry as a business and as a working environment. Porn content creators are in this, from a labor law perspective, are in a triangular relationship with consumers and porn platforms. They tailor their performances to the specific request of consumers, but although they are paid by consumers, they are really under the power of porn platforms who retain percentages every time that consumers pay them. And the porn content creators have no other options but to accept the terms of use of porn platforms if they want to operate via them. So, from a labor law perspective, and I will try to keep this argument short because it might be a little bit boring and too doctrinal, but of course, porn content creators are self-employed. They run their own businesses independently, and this puts them at the opposite pole of employees, who are those who work under a contract of employment and are in a dependency relationship with an employer. Yet, as I have argued, they are under the power of porn platforms. So in the UK, we've got an intermediary category of employment, which is that of workers or limby workers, who are those who interact with a contractual counterpart who is not their direct client or customer because they're integrated into someone else's business. And I argue that porn content creators are integrated into the business of porn platforms. The reason why this is important is that different employment status have different implications in policy terms, and especially they translate differently in terms of rights and duties. So only workers and employees are the ones that are protected the most in the labor market. And I maintain that because porn content creators are under the power of porn platforms should be responsible to protect them from a health and safety perspective. First of all, because porn content creators need training. Some of my research participants reported to me that in terms of actual training, there's nothing that they have done in a sort of sit-down situation. So what they do is that they learn as they go. They learn on your feet. They said it's like any other self-employed job. They develop their own skills and they are self-taught, but there is no school of online fucking, and I'm quoting here. There's no one there to teach you and say, do this and do that. It's their own decision. So this again shows the stigma, because one of the most frequent ways through which participants would resist the stigma of sex work is by forming a close-knit community and supporting each other. Goffman, in his work on stigma, says that the people that share the stigmatizing trait would support each other by sharing the tricks and trades of their business. And this is what sex workers are doing in the porn industry. Yet, it's not an easy job, and actually training is required. For instance, when I interviewed participants engaging in BDSM type of porn, they reported me that they had to pay dominatrix in dungeons and watch them to learn to perform that kind of sexual activity in the safest possible manner. Webcam girls, one might think being a webcam girl is very easy, but actually what they do is that they spend nights watching other webcam girls, training, doing research, and paying them. And again, we see the stigma, because what my research participants said is, oh, well, but that was my personal preference because I wanted to do well. And then somehow they also criticized the other webcam girls that were not putting as much energy and investing in proper training. So actually we see that training is needed in the porn industry if porn content creators want to succeed. And going back to the law, actually the law says that training should be at the expense of the employer, but also self-employed individuals. So even if porn content creators truly were self-employed and not under the power of porn platforms, this does not free the porn platforms from being under the duty to support porn content creators from a health and safety perspective. And in the UK, there's case law that really supports this, because the law says that it really does not matter what is the legal title that we give to an employment relationship, but we should actually be guided by the factual reality. And training is not the only aspect of the job where porn content creators need support. Another aspect is, of course, connected to sexual health. Of course, in the porn industry, many people work in partnership and share content with one another. And what my research participants reported to me is that ideally they're all working at the same standard and they're testing, and that the porn industry is clean. The problem is, of course, when someone has intercourse with someone from outside, then that's how sexually transmitted diseases are brought within the porn industry. However, they are self-regulating how to avoid the presence of sexually transmitted diseases and infections in the industry. And so some of them reported to me that they were testing every 14 days, others every 28 days, others every 12 weeks. And the problem is that after COVID, the way that these testings are performed is at home, at your own expense. And some in the UK, these tests can be very expensive, up to £300. So again, breaking news, actually it should be the porn platforms that potentially from a legal perspective would be under the duty to support porn content creators, because the British Health and Safety Executive have said that even in the case of the gig economy, the platforms should be protecting the health and safety of their workers. And there has been a very interesting case looking at couriers during COVID that has said that the app was responsible for providing them with PPE, masks, gels, gloves, so it's not unreasonable for us to expect the porn industry to send those who are operating via them condoms or test kits. It should actually be in line with the law. So once again, the reason why this probably is not happening is because of the stigma of sex work. No one dares to actually start saying or thinking, well, actually we can enforce health and safety regulation also in the porn industry. So what porn content creators are doing is that they have put in place mechanisms of resistance where they have formed a close-knit community that supports each other and who are regulating how to stay safe online. But probably I conclude that it is quite possible that in line with the law, actually the platforms should be supporting the mechanisms that porn content creators have put in place to protect them at best. So thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them later.
Thank you so much. Later is now, I believe. So, what time is it? My phone runs fast, which shouldn't be possible, but my phone has elected to live off-grid. But I think, if I minus how fast I think it is, we should have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. And so I will...
Thank you. I have a question for Ruby. My name is Ines, and I'm coming from Sweden and working at RFSL Stockholm, which is a human rights organization. You talked about different anti-sex work alliances, and I started to think about this narrative against sex workers that is very dominant in Sweden. Somehow it seems that this narrative is very much mixed or combined with peer survivors' stories of human trafficking as well as sexual abuse. And these are the stories that take public place, and somehow even for the persons who want to stand up for sex workers' rights, this feeling of discomfort and shame somehow is produced by these narratives. So since you defined a bit like how these anti-sex work alliances could look like, could we sort of have some sort of uniform set to respond to some of these patterns, I would say, since they are very repetitive, at least in Sweden, for a couple of years now?
I don't think that... Thank you, Marin. I don't think that there is one solution which fits all groups, yeah. But I would agree that the aspect of shame and promiscuity is the deep story of all these alliances. Yeah, it's like an anti-emancipatory approach towards sexuality, towards reproductive rights. And sometimes the access point comes from the anti-prostitution, anti-sex work point of view. Sometimes it comes more from the misogynist or the idea of patriarchy and like in incel or masculine, I cannot pronounce masculinism movements, yeah. And so it needs a very broad answer towards all of this. And I think indeed this is one thing which, well, politically it wasn't responded by the sex work movement yet, because we never have been able so far, I think we can, provide alliances with a broader emancipatory movement in society. Yeah, like we have always been isolated, marginalized in the discourse itself. So this is why sex workers' rights are not only beneficial for sex workers, they are beneficial for the whole society. And an attack on sex workers' rights means always an attack towards society. Yeah? And this is the framework I'm coming from. This is why I want to look towards sex work phobia in the same structure than towards racism or classism, yeah? And in order to provide alliances. And the specific, one thing more, then I'm done, thank you for the question, is what I thought, listening to the other presentations, is that the point of, or the way stigma represents in certain countries, in certain societies, it depends on the way the law is working towards sex workers. And the stigma in New Zealand is a different kind of stigma than it is in Scotland or in Ireland. And I think this is something we should spend more energy in analyzing and understanding. And then this means a response towards the alliances we should maybe put together.
Thank you so much. Sex worker rights as a kind of barometer for the whole of the society that we are living in. Anyone else? You'll break Becky's heart if nobody asks Becky a question. Elizabeth. Sorry. Can you pass it down? Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. Becky, hi. I'm wondering, was there a difference in the way that respondents felt about stigma in cities versus rural areas in Ireland?
I couldn't really say because the two places that we done interviews were Dublin and Limerick, which are two of the biggest cities. There were some participants that were based in different areas of the country, but nothing really stood out to differentiate any experiences in rural areas from city areas. Yeah, so I can't really answer. Yeah.
Can I ask either of you, did you find a difference in terms of recruitment of participants based on the legal framework in the country that you were researching?
Well, actually, coming off the back of that question, I think, because I did interview a few sex workers in Scotland who were quite rural, but I think the biggest issue for them was isolation and not feeling community. I think their experiences of stigma could be worse, but I think isolation was the biggest thing for them. And what was your question, Maren? I literally just forgot it.
No worries.
What is
Great question. It was about recruiting sex workers for interviews based on,
yeah.
Was there differences, did you notice, depending on the legal framework? Is it easier to reach sex workers depending on whether they fear the law or not? I don't know if that was something that you became aware of with the research.
Yeah, well, luckily we're both sex workers and know a lot of sex workers, which is great. Because I think researchers sometimes come into places and don't know anybody, and they're not sex workers, and they don't really know how to recruit people. But I did find I had a few people really interested in the study, and then they dropped out because they didn't feel safe. And I was very upfront about it being 100% anonymous and confidential, and I gave that whole thing. But yeah, it wasn't always easy because of the legal framework, because some of these people are teachers and lawyers and doctors, and they don't want to lose their day jobs, which might happen, which is very much not not great if they were found out to be a sex worker. So yeah, it was definitely challenging for me. I don't know if your experiences of that in Ireland though, like recruitment based on the Nordic model, like was that difficult to recruit people?
I wouldn't say it was difficult based on it being the Nordic model. Like one thing we flagged when we were coming up with the questionnaire was that not all sex workers are aware of the legal model they're working under, and there's still a lot of sex workers that don't know anything has changed since 2017. So you're still dealing with the stigma and trying to reach across stigma, secrecy, and people being a bit isolated. But the recruitment was all based on our own networks and snowballing out from there. So the legal model itself didn't really come into play in the recruitment.
But having sex workers as the researchers themselves really helped with reaching people. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you so much for really fascinating presentations. I'm stuck with Ruby's presentation, of course, thinking about the intersection of these different movements, and I think you pointed to very important strategy that they are adopting, the loafer strategy, right? And I think this is also an interesting, except for changing the narrative, as Ines was saying that they are taking over the narrative with the survivors, etc., victim-centered narrative. But also there is a space, so there is work to be done there. But I think that the fact that they used loafer is also a space for some alliance building around anti-carceral strategies. So with the growing popularity of prison abolition movement, police abolition movements, the carceral strategies that they are pushing for might, in some circumstances, at least within some sectors of social movements, seem not really, not be that fancied. So, for example, we in Poland build alliances around anti-carcerality, against anti-sex work organizations, which are actually, we have I don't know whether it's, I'm actually curious whether you also have encountered that, but in Poland we have anti-sex work mobilization around the slogan of promotion of prostitution. This is something that started to become very popular, this category of promotion of prostitution early this year, and there are both right-wing and socialist feminist self-perceived socialist feminists that are actually using this notion to silence sex workers' voices. And even we had a situation when the Secretary of State at the Ministry of Justice filed a complaint to the Media Ethics Board against a newspaper that published 2 interviews with sex workers as a promotion of prostitution. They actually had a petition calling for the criminalization of promotion of prostitution, meaning giving space to sex workers in the public media to speak, which basically mirrors the gay propaganda laws that are gaining some popularity in the region as well for quite some time. And I'm just curious whether you also have these challenges and how do you deal with them, with the promotion of prostitution threat. Thanks.
Yeah, well, you know, the discourse is very specific to each country. And I think if one is analyzing the composition of the anti-sex work movement, then you have different like narratives, yeah? And often these narratives are decoupled from the origin. Like when we are talking about religious or promiscuity narratives, yeah, then ESWA will never talk about the religious background of that, yeah, but they will operate the same narrative, and they will operate like a choice of wording, which is often not completely understood by the surrounding, but it rings a bell. Yeah, and people think, oh, that's easy. I can, you know, that's the easy way. Yeah, it's avoiding complexity of the matter. It's avoiding the self-reflection on the own biases. But it is like plain. It's a little plain for them to reconnect, and then they provide a connectivity. The sex work movement is not providing, now I'm hearable, I think, but I was talking about the connectivity, which is so important. And I would like identify 4 narratives which are super important, which is the binarity, yeah, like it's victims which are feminized or womanized, and perpetrators which are, yeah, in their vision, they are not structural but male. Then we have the anti-capitalist movement, which are like talking, yeah, sex work is not work, yeah, it's violence, it's rape. Then we have the idea of victim blaming, and we have something which I would like to know from the other panelists. In Germany, we have a very strong anti-cancel culture debate, and an anti-wokeism debate, yeah? So where it is like everything which is emancipatory, which is feminist, is labeled as woke and bad, and it's an attack on free speech, yeah? This is something which is like very frequently used as an argument. And within these 4 narratives, they do a circle. They exchange their arguments, and we should interrupt it. Yeah, just very plain. We need to interrupt, always counteracting their narratives. We should provide our own narratives and do political storytelling.
I don't know if anyone else on the panel wanted to jump in on that, just in something they... Oh, got a question. Okay.
I'm going to go in a different direction. Is that okay? Is that all right? Okay, great. Rebecca, I had a question for you, actually, in terms of like professional training and how porn platforms. Sorry. And I'm curious why you chose the approach to look at platformization as a space for training, as opposed to maybe strengthening the ways in which peer-to-peer networks support one another in the industry. Because I feel sometimes, what I fear is how what happens when a platform has control over a narrative, and how much influences do workers have in narratives that get told in porn. And would eventually, like, what would happen to porn narratives in a way if it's just like this industry training all the time? And I think that the beauty of porn is also comes from the worker's perspective and being able to be independent in what workers can do sometimes. And so I think that there's such a strong history of sex work families and getting information passed down from sex worker to sex worker. And I feel like that actually might contribute to a better, healthier, not only sex working community, but also what people have access to in terms of porn. And so it's not just like this like white heterosexual ickiness like all the time, essentially. Which might happen if like a powerful platform gets
on this issue, then actually there are 2 points that need to be made. One, the first one is legal. There is a broader movement, especially here in the European Union, that platforms are default employers because actually, like it or not, they're exercising lots of power over the workers. So this idea that they are independent, autonomous, and flexible, it's kind of a smokescreen, and there is some sort of power dynamic and a dependency relationship going on. So, and linked to this, I didn't have the time to delve into it in my presentation, but I argue that in order to preserve this willingness of sex workers to stay autonomous and independent, I suggest trying to empower them with this intermediary worker status category that we've got in the UK that then comes with many of the benefits of being self-employed, but at the same time protect the workers with having some core labor rights given to them, such as the right to a minimum wage, working time regulation. But then going back to whether it's okay to leave them self-regulating, well, yes, they're doing great. I think they're an example, especially also towards many other jobs, like they were the example during COVID on what we should do to avoid the spread of certain diseases. But it's also very expensive to self-test, to do training. So is it fair that they have to do it out of their pocket when the law clearly says that it should be those who are exercising power over them to at least support them economically? So what I have tried to suggest is try and find a balance, a mechanism where the platforms are going to be responsible to support their training and try to support the already great mechanisms that they have in place. But they do need that. I find it unfair that they have to do it out of their time, out of their money, with no compensation. That's working time. From a legal perspective, I find it unfair that they have to do it on their own, although they're doing great. But thank you for the question. It's a good question, of course.
I had a question for Rebecca as well. So I was wondering, I absolutely love the idea of having the platforms be responsible in different ways, but since these platforms have a lot of porn creators who are from various parts of the world, and you're using the example of UK at the moment and the case law that's applicable to UK, how do you envision this maybe then being useful for the rest of the world and content creators from different parts?
Thank you for the question. This is a very good question, and that's a big problem in internet law is the borderless nature of the internet, what should we be doing? But then, we've got legislation like the General Data Protection Regulation. There, I even say now the Online Safety Act in the UK that really they have these legislations, provisions that say it does not matter where the platform is registered, where the worker or the person is registered. What matters is that the platform is targeting the individual in my specific jurisdiction, in my specific legislation. So if we want it, it could be done. Yeah? Sorry, I'm not sure I understand your question. Are you asking me how we can potentially solve the fact that there might be other countries where our legislation cannot read? But that's already an existing problem. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Now the UK is out of the EU, but we still have some sort of connection, and we have retained some legislation. Like at the moment, my presentation, I shouldn't even be doing it, because from the European Union perspective, they should be automatically employees of the platforms, but like it or not, is stigmatized, and so no one even dares to say, yes, they're workers, they're employees. But if we were going to be respecting the law, the platforms are actually their employers in the UK, in the EU context. But still, therefore, we should already have this difference with the other states or countries where this, unfortunately, it's not happening. I don't know how I can solve this problem, unfortunately. It's bigger than me.
My incredibly unreliable phone believes that I will hand it over to Irena because she's my colleague and gets privileges.
I will just add to this discussion, because I think, first of all, we are saying that the EU is actually creating the global standard, because the platform operates globally, so there is some assumption that maybe that the effect could reach also the other countries beyond the EU. And the second thing is, it's actually within the fight against exploitation, trafficking, and etc. But there is a huge discussion about the due diligence. And that's actually the angle of view how they could prove their responsibility and commitment to fight trafficking, exploitation, and this kind of discourse behind. So the due diligence is probably the also option.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. I appreciate that 90 minutes, especially after lunch, after a big boozy lunch, you all gave very kind attention, and thank you so much as well to our panelists. You were awesome. And I believe there is coffee and maybe cake.